So what we're going to talk about today is, does a phase one, phase two approach ever actually work? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes, I think it does work. But there's some tips and tricks that I want to pass along today. And as we're going along, feel free to speak up and give examples or possibly questions as well. So mainly want this to be conversational as we go. So does anybody know, has anybody ever seen this map before? It's of Boston, Massachusetts, and it's in the eastern part of the US. And if you ever drive through Boston, Massachusetts, you see that it's really fascinating the way that you drive from the airport to any place. You actually go under buildings, under skyscrapers. You go you go through places that look like they were just created so that there was a road there. And there was this huge project that took 15 years or so to really fully do. I think more unofficially, it was more like 5 to 10 years. But it was called, the project was called the Big Dig. And it had a few other names for the project, but essentially it's a phased approach because this thing, what you're looking at with all of the roads changing, was not something that you could do in a year or 2 years or 3 years. So you had to have a lot of different phases where something moved around for a period of a couple of years, and then a road opened up. And then people could use that road. And then later on, there would be another connection point for the same road. So it definitely used like a phased approach. And that's what we're going to talk about today, except primarily with software, Internet of Things, that kind of thing. So this is the gist of what we're going to talk about today. Are there best practices with a phase one, phase two approach? And by that, I mean a scenario where a product has features A, B, and C in 1 year, and then the following year adds features D, E, and F. How can you avoid overcommitting or making people unhappy? And how do you convey this plan in a roadmap? So we'll cover examples of phased approaches, which groups to consider when you're doing a phased approach, when to use one, and when not to use a phased approach. And I think we'll skip pretty fast through a few of the sections, but I think that, start thinking as we're going about examples of phased approaches with popular products. I'd like to hear from you guys on some of the later slides. So a little bit about me. I am a senior product manager for a company called AvidXchange that does US domestic solutions for payment and invoicing. And in the past, I've worked on mobile, web, and API products. I really love my company, but we generally operate in North American region, and you can look us up. So let's start talking about a product that's kind of near and dear to me, and it's a product called Robinhood. And I'm not sure if everybody knows exactly what Robinhood is, but I'm using an example from 2 years ago. I'm using it on purpose so that we can look back at it and laugh. And Robinhood's core competency is what you see in the screenshot. It's that you can trade stocks from the NASDAQ stock market, from the New York Stock Exchange, international stock markets. And that is what you do there. When you look at any particular stock, you can see that over the course of a one-day period, the price goes up, the price goes down. And it's a really good product for people that are just trying to first get into stock trading. With each of the stocks, you see you can basically buy or sell. You have 2 options. And this is a screenshot from a couple of years ago. It really still is that same kind of experience. You can also research a little bit of what the stock is by looking at that page. and it's all in mobile, but they also developed a web application. So they decided to ship a new feature that was very important for their customers, their market, their investors. And it was probably so important that, that they probably had a lot of meetings about Bitcoin. And Bitcoin 2.5 years ago, the landscape was this. Bitcoin was growing exponentially in value. It was very unstable, going up and down, but overall it was always increasing. So you see, like, this is an example of just a particular day 2 years ago where all of the different cryptocurrencies were increasing in value. And so that was a tremendous opportunity for them. But they didn't have Bitcoin features. So they had to figure out, how do we put them in the app? So here's what they did. Remember what the core competency is. It's stocks. And where is stocks on the mobile app? It's actually below the cryptocurrencies. This was so important for Robinhood that they said, put the cryptocurrencies above the stocks. And that shows the level of commitment that they had. But there's more to the story. When you clicked on any of the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin being one of them, this is what you would see. It's a different user interface. It's more design friendly. You know, it looks really new and up to date. Looks really cool. But where are my buttons on the bottom that say I can buy or sell it? I couldn't. So they actually shipped this feature so that I could see Bitcoin, but I couldn't buy or sell it. And they put it above all of the stocks that you use the app to buy or sell. The only button that I have is invite friends, and it says I'm on the list. So someday I'll be able to buy and sell Bitcoin. And that's where we were a couple of years ago. Is, you know, this was the hot new thing. It was so important to the business that they put it above all of the stocks. And they anticipated that everybody was going to want to buy and sell this. But they shipped this feature without being able to buy and sell it. And the only thing you could do was invite friends. So that's a really fascinating case study to me, that they put something out there that you couldn't actually do what was your core competency in. Because let's go back. Your core competency really has to do with these things. It's not just viewing stocks. So for them to do this with the Bitcoin, that the only thing you could do was invite friends, and you couldn't actually buy or sell it. That was a big risk. But they probably had information that we don't have today, and it probably turned out okay for them in the end. Just so that everybody kind of understands, with Bitcoin 2 years ago, I think one of the reasons why it hasn't caught on more in the past couple of years is market instability. So market instability was something that they probably weren't anticipating for Bitcoin. And so I don't think that it ever quite caught on the way that they thought it would. But I think it actually didn't turn out that that was because of you know, how they did it in the app. It's just a weird coincidence that it didn't turn out to be quite as hot of an idea as they thought it would be. So I'm going to pause here, and you know, this might be a good opportunity, you know, for folks in the audience to start thinking about other examples of phased approaches with products. After the next slide, I'll ask for your examples, and you can also probably put it in chat. So I'll hit on one more example that I have here. So this is an example of phased approaches, Microsoft Dynamics GP. So it's an ERP system for financials. And you see what they've been doing over the years is every year they have a couple of releases in general. And there's all of these like feature 2.0, feature 3.0, feature 1.0 things. So that's how they're doing kind of a phased approach. They're saying, we're going to split up our features into a 1.0 category and a 2.0 category. And then, you know, the things that we don't get to, then we'll get to later in the 2.0. So, so this is where I think I would like to pause and see, does anybody have any other examples of products that are doing a phased approach for feature rollouts in the marketplace?
Mithil
Yeah,
here. So,
hi.
would WhatsApp be one of the best examples for a phased approach? Like I know when WhatsApp first started, it was purely a status update app, an app that would allow you to update statuses. And even when other applications like WeChat and a lot of these other chat applications would allow you to call and make voice calls, video calls, and WhatsApp didn't do that, right? WhatsApp gave you time to understand the features that were built in, uh, get used to the features, and then probably they launched voice call and video call much more later than all the other competitors, right? So I think that's one of the great examples for a phased approach.
Yeah, I think that WhatsApp is a great example of this. And, this might be a good opportunity to actually look up and see, is there a published WhatsApp roadmap that kind of indicates that sort of thing? But I think you're dead on that that and some other chat apps that I can think of, especially in the mobile space that then went into the web, or they started in the web and then went into the mobile space. I think that there's a lot of great examples there. So really appreciate that example. So let's talk about whom to consider when you're doing a phased approach. And so I think that one of the things that we just touched on with Robinhood especially is that current users should be considered. So think about what their experience is when you're rolling out something that maybe isn't the whole thing. So you're rolling out something that is a feature 1 and then you'll get feature 2 later. Think about those current users. And this is a really broad topic, operations. So your company has an operations team, and depending on what your company does, that might be DevOps, that might be your support team, that might be your onboarding team, that could be a lot of different things. And you have to think about, when you start collecting all of that cryptocurrency data, does it overload your servers? Do you have to really think about the impacts to the business that your feature is going to give? Um, so really importantly, I think, is what about your sales team? So if you have a product that actually gets sold, it's a B2B product or even some B2C products, think about how you want your sales team to sell a product that isn't final and a product that is evolving as they go. Do they just wait until phase 2? Or do they try to sell it in phase 1 and then give people your roadmap? So that's something definitely to think about. What about your support team, the people that field the issues that people have with your application or your product? What kind of messaging should they be equipped to do? Is this such a thing that they're going to have different problems in phase 1 than they do in phase 2? It's very likely. So then lastly, think about your dev team and your executive team. Think about your dev team, because your dev team has to operate in cycles of developing the features here that we're talking about. And how are they going to break that up? They might have some good ideas on that. Developers always have great ideas on just about everything. And then lastly, your executive team. How are they going to respond to your idea of doing a phased approach and breaking things up? If they're not from a mindset or from a company that has tried this before, they might need some examples of how you envision this working. And just make sure, as you're doing all this, you're not biting off more than you can chew. So I think what I want to do now is talk about a few examples of when to use a phased approach, and we'll pause every couple of slides so that if you guys have comments or questions, you can speak up. So one of the main reasons to do this is when something's huge. So think back to that map that we were looking at and all of the things that needed to change on that map. Well, if your customers and your internal stakeholders desire something really huge, split it up on the roadmap as a phased rollout. It will help be a reality check for them. You can drive conversations and acceptance of the plan by putting that plan in front of people. You're not promising perfection if you split it up into multiple years, multiple quarters, whatever you have to do to convey this in a roadmap. And then I think that a lot of times when you convey something that's a phased rollout, it looks like you're ambitious and you have a big plan for your company. So it actually makes you look good a lot of the time, even if somebody might disagree with your plan. The fact that you have tried to do a plan is definitely something. Then, I want to touch on this topic. So think about what that phase one actually is. Does it offer enough value that people will use the thing? So if you're shipping something that has a button on it, but it doesn't have button 2, 3, and 4 on it, are your customers, your users, actually going to use the button to do the thing that they're supposed to do? Definitely something to think about. If the product is complex, the feature is complex, whatever you're trying to do is complex enough that they won't really use it until all phases are complete, you probably don't want to use a phased approach for this. When I think of complex things, you think of a Tesla car, something like that. Like probably want to have a second thought on that. So, those are a couple of examples to use a phased approach. Let's give you a couple of more examples, and then we'll stop for comments and questions. If it will minimize long development cycles. So think about how your team works and how long things take for them. If developing the thing that you're talking about is going to just take a long time for engineers, you might start to get a loss of interest from the people that want the thing that you're building. And also it makes it so that, let's say that you're doing long development cycles, and you're shipping everything in the end, you're not going to have a very large window to correct mistakes if you don't have iterations and phases as you do those. So phased approach is something to really explore with that dev team for that. And one more slide before some comments and questions. Since developers often work in agile cycles these days, product managers can even separate the developer or the development launch from a marketing launch. So what you could do is you could say, I want development launches 1, 2, and 3, and then we're not going to announce it to all of the customers and do a big marketing push until it's complete or until it's at this phase. So you can separate those two ideas when you're doing this. So I'll pause there. Any comments and questions so far with the when to use a phased approach? The comments in the chat is, do B2B products usually follow a phased approach as they have a longer release cycle? I see that we're, at least the companies that I'm, working with most often, including my own company, we definitely try to do that phased approach quite a bit. If it's like a big migration of people from one product line to another, then I see that that's a different kind of thing a lot of times. But if it's a value add feature, I do see quite a bit of that being done in the B2B space, especially with financials. Next question, is building an MVP considered a phased approach? I think it is. I think I'm going to touch on a couple of other things here where making sure that your MVP actually is an MVP is important. But also, that's kind of at the whole product kind of thought. There's also the idea of putting a feature onto a product. So that's quite a common way to do a phased approach too. But building an MVP, I think, is a phased approach idea. Ooh, somebody has a really good example. So Oracle's Student Management Cloud is one great example for not releasing a half-baked product into the market with phased release approach. It's unusable, and so that's what you guys are saying is that it's unusable due to this, and many customers were driven away from this. So so that's an example of what not to do. I think when we looked earlier at the Robinhood example, I think that a lot of us who are product managers would not have shipped that feature and would not have done what Robinhood did. And that's something that, looking back on it, was it a success or a failure? I'm not entirely sure which of those two it is for Robinhood, but I think that it's something that somebody was mighty brave to do what they did. And it sounds like Oracle's Student Management Cloud either was buggy or it was a lot like that. So then Mukul has a comment. Every phase should be of value to the customer. Any tips on how to break a feature into phases? I think that we'll get to that in the next few slides. I think especially that first phase, making sure that it is something that somebody can use, so that the thing that you're shipping is usable and people don't become, not respondent. Think about what your core competency is, what the buttons are that you'd like people to click, what the actions are that they can do. Each phase should progress what somebody can actually do in the application and not just be something that is half-baked. So really good question, Mukul, and I think it's kind of a topic that we will comment on several different slides here. So getting a lot of questions. So Mander says, will the timeline difference between dev launch and marketing launch be ideal, generally speaking? I think that, so in the past, I've held back some marketing campaigns until a later phase because it was a usable product, but it wasn't a marketable product. So that's something to think about is, when you have something that might be usable but not marketable, you can delay the marketing part. Or you can do the reverse of that. That's what Robinhood did. They went to market with it, but it wasn't usable. So they did the opposite of that. And I don't think that worked as well. But those are some things to think about. Vinay asks, can you break features into a group based upon the priority of value added to customers? Yeah, I think that that's your job as a product manager, totally. So product managers should be starting to think about what makes sense to ship first. Sometimes it's not the value added to the customers, but if you can think about it from that perspective, then it's a great idea. Sometimes you have to do something technically before you do something else. So that's the counter example on that, when there's a technical reason to do a phased approach. Duolingo had a phased approach year after year to grab the market and expand the business. And I think you're right, especially with its international expansion. We'll touch on that in a future slide as well. Will the reverse approach, and the reverse approach, I think what you mean here, Mandar, is the reverse approach to do a marketing launch before a dev launch, before a final dev launch. Yeah, that's what you mean. Will that affect delivery promises? If you failed to deliver, it'd probably damage your reputation. Bingo. I think that that's a big part of this. You have to think about the company's reputation. And sometimes you do a phased approach so that something is out there, so that somebody is expecting, and so that it won't get snatched away from you from the roadmap. So think about that. But also then think about, you've conveyed it to a customer. Are you absolutely sure that the phased approach is actually going to happen for that customer, or is it a true experiment? If it's a true experiment to find out if they'll use it, then I might hold back my marketing. I might hold back how many people I show that plan to externally. So definitely something to think about. Yeah, thanks, Mandar. And Makul, last comment. Your view that you can release multiple phases and then do a big bang marketing. Absolutely, I think you can totally do that, and it does work. It's not a very risky thing to do there, unless your customers are expecting marketing sooner. So you have to temper what you're going to, or taper what you're going to try to convey to the market. So thanks for all those comments and questions that you've sent in so far, and I'll come back to those at the end. A few more ideas on, when to use a phased approach. So think about workflow in your application, in your product. So if it's not a workflow, it is much better for trying to do a phased approach. So think about things like your feature is to make the application faster, or to make it more stable, or security improvements. I find that people that care about performance, stability, security, they tend to understand when you try to do a phased approach quite well. If it's a workflow type feature and you're going to go as a user from this screen to this screen to this screen, and you ship phase one, it's just this screen, that is not as good. And it's great to find those things that are performance, stability, or security improvements and break those up into a phase. It shows that you're thinking about those things as a product manager, and people will trust you more for those things. And splitting up those kinds of things will allow you to deliver value faster if they're performance, stability, and security. Get those out on the market. And then I think this is another really good idea. So I don't know if any of you have ever worked with a third party, so working with another company, software integrations, APIs that other companies manage. Think about how you can do a phased approach with that. And one of the great reasons to do that is when you work with other companies, sometimes they're not as motivated to hit deadlines and hit dates as you are. And by having dates to hit and more of them, it sometimes motivates them to continue working with you and not miss that weekly meeting. And hopefully, like, you can continue making progress by doing phased approaches with your third parties. Also, you can pull the plug if it doesn't work. So if you have an idea to just do this huge thing with a bank API or a payment API or something like that, get it out on the market, and you're going to have to do a ton of work on it later. Let's try to get it out there to make sure that this is still the right idea and that you're going to market the same way. So let's get into when not to use a phased approach, and then we'll have questions after these slides. Major UI changes or site relaunches. So I don't want to call out any company myself, because I'm thinking of a particular company in the US that has done a site relaunch that's in a phased approach. But here's the experience for the user when you do that kind of thing. They go to your site, and then there's some of the links in the navigation take you to pages that are the old design, and some of them take you to pages that are the new design. You see lots of iframes and things like that in there. So those things are not great to try to do. Sometimes you have to, because rebuilding your entire site or your entire product isn't done in a day. But they're not ideal when you have to do that. And so when you guys inherit legacy software as your product, really think about those things and how you can do these in chunks. But sometimes it's not a really great experience for the user if you do. Because customers will need to continue to be able to use your solution and solve their problem while you are going through this phased approach, and they'll still be using it. And so you have to think about that. So here's another thing that I encounter, and I'm not sure how you guys have encountered it in the past, but feel free to let me know in chat. Some organizations really like that idea of phase two, and you're in a meeting with different stakeholders and somebody says, oh, that's phase two. And you know, when you have something that's a good idea to do, somebody just says, oh, phase two, and your phase two bucket gets really big really fast. And some organizations use that phase two as a maybe, and that's not a great time to use a phased approach. If everything in phase two is a maybe, then maybe you're not doing phase two. And there's this old article that I can't find anymore called The Myth of 2.0. And that's what it says is companies think that they're going to do a 2.0 version, and they never do. So this is the reasoning why when you encounter that in the world, you know, to avoid it, it creates the temptation to not plan your product as thoughtfully as possible, because it's easy to add features and say, put it in phase two, and they're not critical. But the next phase feels distant, and you pile things in there, and you never know if you'll get there, and perhaps you won't. And so that makes it illegitimate as the phased approach. A couple of more. So think about this, and I think that some of the comments in chat especially have definitely like rung true with this thing. When a phase isn't justifiable on its own. So think about what that phase one or what that phase two is. By itself, is it an MVP? Is it a thing that has a return on investment that can be measured later? Don't use the phased approach if your phase one especially isn't justifiable on its own. And maybe it's just collecting email addresses that you're getting in phase one. Think about it. Is that justifiable? Make sure you keep that core goal well defined and that you return to it at each stage of the project to confirm that you're still geared towards solving that central problem. Okay, so now think about this one. Don't use the phased approach if customers will not use the product until both phases are complete. You aren't going to gain any valuable information if the phase one you rush out doesn't get used by the user. So I think that this is definitely a topic from Robinhood that we looked at. You couldn't use the feature. All you could do was invite friends. You couldn't buy or sell cryptocurrency. So that's an example of not using the phased approach because it's not usable until that phase two. So again, I wouldn't have shipped the Robinhood feature that we looked at, but some people were brave enough to do so, but this is why I would not have shipped it. So with that, I think that we've covered examples of phased approaches, whom to consider when phasing, when to use a phased approach, and when not to use a phased approach. And we'll make these slides available later so that you can run through these and see if you have further thoughts on this. But that is my presentation. So I want to go to the phones and hear, does anybody have any comments, questions, or things that they'd like to add to this discussion? Vishal asked, which is the best framework to phase out the product launch? I'm thinking Agile would be a good one to try to do that with. I think there's ways to use it with waterfall as well, especially if you like have a contractor team or somebody that's a resource that might not stay with you forever. Waterfall might make sense, but I think a lot of this ties in really well to Agile frameworks. And let me know if that's not what you mean by framework, but that's how I interpreted that.
Sorry, Matt, I had a question there.
Yes.
So shouldn't your phases be also directly proportional to the metrics and how your phase one is performing, and that's how you're supposed to build phase two as well?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something there to keep with the core thing that you're trying to do in your phase one and measure it as you're doing your rollouts, so that you can figure out this is the impact that you had with phase one after the fact, and this is the impact that you had with phase two, and then you can make hypotheses about what your phase one might do, and then compare them after the fact. So I think that that's definitely something that I would recommend. Do you have any thoughts on how to do that as well?
Yeah, so what I was thinking, right? Basis
Mm.
the data that you collect from phase one, various sources, right? And understand how your phase one's, how your product is performing, and basis that, then go and decide your phase two features and not have a rollout plan at the start itself, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that phase two could be if your phase two could be disbanded based upon the metrics that you find in the phase one. I think that that's always a reality, in this way of doing things. Um, Now, if your project is to build roads that get people all around Boston, you want to make sure that if you do bail on phase two and you do decide not to do a phase two, that everything still works. So that's the one caution that I have on that is make sure that phase one is enough of a thing to measure. Yeah, great question. Um, McCool has a great comment. Accessibility support. So I would think what you mean by accessibility support is, allowing disabled users to use websites, allowing, people with visual impairments, that kind of thing. And that definitely sounds like something that would fall into that, performance improvement slash security slash stability kind of bucket. Accessibility support seems like a great candidate for this, unless you have users that are expecting a certain standard of support and that's already been committed. But I think you can roll that out, and say that you have a roadmap to get there, and your business will probably understand pretty well. The question is if your users will understand, but I think that's a great example of trying something there. Did somebody have a question there? Okay, so Amanda, how about the phased approach is justifiable in the beginning and later is not realizable? How to adapt. So, I think that that's definitely like a thing that happens out in the marketplace. You want to make sure that you know how important your phase two is by the time you launch phase one, so that if phase two gets shelved, if it doesn't happen, that's going to be really important. So making sure that you never know what tomorrow is going to hold. Make sure that your releases of products, whether they be a marketing release or a development release, make sure that those things make sense when you release them. If you don't have any buttons for the user to do something on a page that you launched, and then you don't do anything further, well, that's all that anybody will ever get on that page. So that's definitely something to think about. There are also the examples sometimes where, the data that you get on phase one is bad enough that you need to remove that feature. That does happen. I can't think of any company that's done it, but I'm sure that it happens out there. So how do we measure the delivered benefits of functionality if it gets split into two phases? How do you measure benefits? So there's financial benefit that your company might realize. There's user satisfaction, like surveys, things like that. You can point to different metrics on this. And I think that the stakes are a lot higher when there's finance involved and there's money involved. But you definitely can ship a feature out there and then find out what people thought on the feature by doing a survey. Now, know your users and how much they like change when you do that kind of thing, because some users just simply don't like change, so they won't like anything that you ship. But if you have some benchmark to compare with how finance was before the feature and how user satisfaction was before the feature, I think that that makes a lot of sense. Oh, how to manage different contributors, which are teams in a product roadmap. So software development where multiple teams contribute. So here's an example, I would say, of kind of a phased rollout where your first phase, maybe you don't have the API team doing anything to the API product. So you're just using what you have to build features into an application. And then later on in phase 2, that's when you involve the API team and you say, actually, we need this endpoint, this API, and you add more things. And then you have 2 teams working in phase 2. Or you could have the vice versa kind of approach. You could say in phase 1, I have multiple teams working on this, but phase 2, I actually only have 1 team and it's the marketing team or something. So think about how all of that fits into this. Think about the way that those teams operate and the kinds of dev cycles that they have if they're engineering teams, and how well this is going to work with their overall mission. So yeah, these can become major undertakings if you have more than 1 team. And if you are dependent on that other product, think about when is the best time for that other product to be updated. You know that your product you probably have control over to make the updates that you need at a greater capacity than somebody else's product. So be very cognizant of that. Okay. Kush, I think I'm gonna skip your question because I maybe want to come back to it. Amy, I think does phase 1, phase 2 approach differ for startups of size to 8 to 10, where the product is just taking form and the team is really small? I think that this probably is a valid approach to do that. I find that phased approaches, the way that I've been discussing them here, really tends to be about larger firms, larger companies. And I really didn't touch on the startup mentality of you're just trying to get something out there to the market. But I think it's still valid. Make sure that if you're doing phases, that each of them makes sense and can stand on their own as phases. There's one thing to just do iterations, and you have a product right now that works for certain scenarios, and then you do another iteration and it just has a few enhancements. But there's no like long-term, phased plan to get X number of enhancements in there. Think about if you just want to handle it by, as you go, as opposed to doing that big phased approach. I think that might be valid for a lot of smaller startups as well. So follow up on the multiple teams idea. Will the roadmap be dynamic in case release cycles are different for the 2 teams? I don't know how to interpret the dynamic part, but what I think, I think that it could be a very interesting scenario if you have an application that can be deployed anytime, and you also have a SaaS-based release of an API that can only go out on the last Friday of every month. You have to think about how do those things line up. There might be some serious project management with getting things to line up and work correctly. There's definitely a thought on backwards compatibility on this whole thing as well. So make sure that, if multiple teams are working on things, that in all states of possible release, that things still actually work. what is the best approach to keep track after phase one is launched and that everybody is happy? Well, I think stakeholder meetings internally are a good way to do that. You might have a corporate culture or a company culture that people don't raise dissents in those kinds of meetings, so you wouldn't fully know. But you can always go back to that qualitative data that you get from surveys. You can do internal surveys, you can do external surveys. Find out what people really think in case they don't want to tell you face-to-face or in a meeting. So, there's a lot of ways to do that. And don't forget about your users. Your users matter a lot on this. Don't ever just listen to the internal stakeholders on the phased approach. Make sure that you get user input on those kinds of things, as long as the users are supposed to know you're doing the phased approach. That's definitely a thought. So I think I have one more here. So I'm going to go back to Kush, your question. So how to mitigate the risks involving in building features in phase two which have dependencies? Do we really commit to those at the start? That's a really good question. When do you need your dependencies filled in order to get to that phase two? Do you do your launch meeting, your kickoff meeting after phase one on phase two? Or do you get commitment sometime before phase one is even launched that next we're going to do this? I think keeping it all to that conditional statement of, if this works the way that I think it's going to work, then this is the plan, and we need these dependencies to be knocked out before phase two ships. I think, keeping in mind that what we do as product managers a lot of times, despite all of this definite, I want to do things for years kind of mentality, what we really do is experiments. And making everything an experiment is very important with everything that you do. And prioritizing what you do with the data that you receive from experiments is also very important. Well, it's been an immense pleasure joining all of you. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll accept your invites after today. And I just really appreciate, it looked like we had about 30 people that showed up to this, and really appreciate the invite. And I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. So thank you so much for having me.